The rain-slicked streets of Seattle gleamed under the sodium glow of streetlights, but Ethan Harper's world was a void darker than the night. For 28 years, he'd lived as a ghost, his true self buried beneath layers of fear and shame. Tonight, though, something reckless stirred in his chest, a spark that refused to be smothered. Ethan stood outside the weathered door of the Anchor, a dive bar tucked in Capitol Hill's vibrant heart. Its neon sign flickered, casting a red hue over the crowd spilling onto the sidewalk. Laughing, carefree, alive. He clutched the strap of his worn backpack, his palms sweaty despite the autumn chill. Inside, he knew, was a world he'd avoided for years. A gay bar, a place where people like him didn't have to hide. But stepping through that door felt like crossing a chasm. What if someone recognized him? What if they saw the truth he'd spent a lifetime concealing? He'd grown up in a small town in eastern Washington, where being different was a sin whispered about in church pews. His father, a stoic mechanic, had once said, "Men don't cry, and they sure as hell don't love other men." Those words had carved themselves into Ethan's soul, chaining him to a life of silence. He'd fled to Seattle at 18, hoping the city's pulse would drown out his fear, but instead, he'd built a new cage, one of solitude. He worked as a freelance graphic designer, his only connections fleeting and digital. No one knew him, no one could hurt him. But tonight, the weight of that isolation was suffocating. He'd seen the flyer for the Anchor's open mic night on a community board at a coffee shop. The words "All are welcome" scrawled in bold letters. It had felt like a dare. Ethan wasn't a performer, but he'd written poetry since he was a kid, words that held the truths he couldn't say aloud. Maybe, just maybe, he could read one tonight. Maybe he could finally be seen. He pushed the door open, and the bar's warmth enveloped him. The air smelled of beer and cedar, and the chatter of voices mingled with the strum of a guitar. The crowd was eclectic. Men in leather jackets, women with vibrant tattoos, non-binary folks in bold makeup, all moving with an ease Ethan envied. He scanned the room, his heart pounding, and found a corner table near the stage. The MC, a wiry man with a glittery vest, called out names, and Ethan's stomach twisted. He'd signed up on a whim, but now, with his name inching closer, doubt clawed at him. "Next up, Ethan Harper," the MC announced. Ethan froze. His legs felt like lead, but the crowd's encouraging applause pulled him forward. He climbed onto the stage, his notebook trembling in his hands. The spotlight burned, exposing him, and for a moment he wanted to bolt. Then he saw a man at the bar, watching him with quiet intensity. He was tall, with broad shoulders and dark eyes that seemed to hold a story of their own. Something about his gaze steadied Ethan. He cleared his throat and began to read. "I hid myself in shadows, where light couldn't reach." His voice wavered at first, but the words poured out, raw and unfiltered. He spoke of fear, of longing, of a heart that ached to be free. The room grew silent, every eye on him, and for the first time, Ethan felt the weight of his truth lift, if only slightly. When he finished, the applause was deafening. He stumbled off the stage, his face flushed, and made his way to the bar, where the man with the dark eyes still "Saturday, that was incredible," the man said, his voice low and warm. "I'm Caleb." Ethan managed a shy smile. "Thanks. I'm Ethan." Caleb's laugh was easy, like a summer breeze. "I figured, since you just owned that stage." He slid a glass of water toward Ethan. "You looked like you needed this." They talked, and Ethan found himself unraveling. Caleb was a firefighter, 30 years old, with a life as open as Ethan's was guarded. He spoke of his own journey, coming out to his conservative family, losing some but gaining others, and finding a home in Seattle's queer community. Ethan listened, captivated, as Caleb's words painted a world where hiding wasn't necessary. As the night wore on, the bar grew louder, but their corner felt like a sanctuary. Ethan admitted he'd never been to a place like this before, and Caleb's eyes softened. "It's scary at first," he said, "but you're here now. That's what matters." When the bar closed, Caleb walked Ethan to his bus stop. The rain had stopped, leaving the air crisp and clean. "You should come back next week," Caleb said, his tone hopeful. "Maybe read another poem." Ethan hesitated, the old fears creeping in. But Caleb's smile was a lifeline, and he nodded. "Maybe I will." As the bus pulled away, Ethan pressed his forehead against the window, his heart racing. For the first time in years, he didn't feel invisible. He didn't know it yet, but that night at the Anchor was the first crack in the walls he'd built around himself. A spark that would soon ignite something unstoppable. Ethan woke the next morning with Caleb's voice echoing in his mind. He lay in his small Capitol Hill apartment, the city's hum filtering through the window. Last night felt like a dream, but the notebook on his nightstand, open to the poem he'd read, proved it was real. He spent the day at his desk, designing a logo for a client, but his thoughts kept drifting to Caleb. The way his eyes crinkled when he laughed. The way he'd really listened when Ethan spoke. It was disorienting, this pull toward someone new. Ethan had always kept people at arm's length. Friends, co-workers, even his sister, Mia, who lived in Portland and called every week, oblivious to the secrets he held. By evening, the pull was too strong. He returned to the Anchor, telling himself it was for the vibe, not for Caleb. But when he saw Caleb at the same bar stool, his heart betrayed him, thudding wildly. Caleb waved him over, and soon they were talking again, the conversation flowing as if they'd known each other for years. Caleb shared stories of his work, rushing into burning buildings, saving lives, and the toll it took. "You learn to live with the fear," he said, his voice steady but laced with something deeper. "But it's worth it to help someone, you know?" Ethan nodded, though he couldn't imagine that kind of courage. He told Caleb about his art, how he poured his emotions into designs and poems, and Caleb listened with a quiet intensity that made Ethan feel seen. Over the next few weeks, Ethan became a regular at the Anchor. Each visit chipped away at his defenses. He read more poems, each one bolder, and the crowd's support emboldened him further. Caleb was always there, cheering loudest, his presence a steady anchor in Ethan's turbulent world. One night, after a particularly raw poem about his father's rejection, Caleb pulled Ethan aside. "You're carrying a lot," he said softly. "You don't have to do it alone." Ethan wanted to protest, to retreat into his familiar solitude, but Caleb's hand on his shoulder stopped him. It was a simple touch, but it burned through Ethan's walls, leaving him exposed and terrified. They started meeting outside the bar, coffee shops, walks along the Puget Sound, late-night diners. Ethan learned Caleb's quirks. His love for old jazz records, his habit of sketching on napkins, his fierce loyalty to his chosen family at the fire station. Caleb learned Ethan's too. His obsession with sci-fi novels, his fear of crowded places, his dream of one day showing his art in a gallery. But Ethan's past clung to him like damp fog. He hadn't told Caleb everything. How his father had caught him kissing a boy at 16 and thrown him out for a week. How he'd learned to hide his desires so well he barely recognized himself. He wanted to tell Caleb, but the words felt like glass in his throat. One evening, at a quiet park near Lake Union, Caleb stopped walking and faced Ethan. The sun was setting, painting the water gold. "You don't have to tell me everything," Caleb said, as if reading his mind. "But I see you, Ethan, and I'm not going anywhere." Ethan's chest tightened. He wanted to believe Caleb, but fear whispered that this, whatever it was, couldn't last. He'd spent too long in the shadows to trust the light. Still, he let Caleb take his hand, their fingers intertwining, and for a moment, the world felt less heavy. But the past wasn't done with Ethan. A week later, his phone buzzed with a text from Mia. "Dad's in Seattle for a conference. He wants to see you." Ethan's stomach dropped. His father, Richard, hadn't spoken to him in years, not since Ethan had left home. The thought of facing him now, when he was finally starting to feel alive, was paralyzing. He didn't tell Caleb about the text. Instead, he withdrew, skipping open mic night and ignoring Caleb's calls. The shadows were pulling him back, and he didn't know how to fight them. But Caleb wasn't one to give up. 3 days later, he showed up at Ethan's apartment, his expression a mix of worry and determination. "Talk to me," Caleb said, stepping inside. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, then let it all spill out. His father's cruelty, his years of hiding, the fear that opening up to Caleb would only lead to pain. Caleb listened, his face unreadable, and when Ethan finished, he did something Ethan didn't expect. He pulled him into a hug. It was warm, fierce, and unwavering, and it broke something in Ethan. Tears came, unbidden, and he clung to Caleb, feeling the spark of that embrace ignite a courage he didn't know he had. The hug lingered in Ethan's bones, a warmth he couldn't shake. For days, he replayed it, the way Caleb's arms had held him like he was something worth holding on to. But the shadow of his father's visit loomed, threatening to smother that fragile light. Ethan agreed to meet Richard at a diner in Belltown, a neutral ground far from the anchor's safety. He arrived early, his hands fidgeting with a napkin as he sat in a corner booth. The diner smelled of coffee and fried eggs, its retro red stools and checkered floor a stark contrast to the storm in Ethan's chest. When Richard walked in, Ethan's breath caught. His father looked older, gray streaking his hair, lines etched deeper around his eyes, but his posture was still rigid, unyielding. "Ethan," Richard said, sliding into the booth. His voice was clipped, like he was addressing a stranger. "You look different." Ethan forced a smile. "It's been a while." He didn't know what to say. The man across from him was a stranger now, yet the weight of his judgment still pressed down. They talked, or rather Richard talked, about his auto shop, the weather, anything but the past. Ethan nodded, his mind half on Caleb, half on the boy he'd been, cowering under his father's disapproval. Finally, Richard leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Mia says you're doing art. That true?" "Yeah," Ethan said, bracing himself. "Freelance design. Some poetry, too." Richard snorted. "Poetry? That's not a job. You need something steady, Ethan. Something real." The word stung, but Ethan didn't flinch. He thought of Caleb's encouragement, the crowd at the anchor cheering his poems. "It's real to me," he said quietly. Richard's face hardened. "You always were soft, too much like your mother." He paused, then added, "I heard you're hanging around places you shouldn't. People talk even in Seattle." Ethan's blood ran cold. He hadn't told Mia about the anchor, but small towns had long memories, and gossip traveled fast. "What's that supposed to mean?" he asked, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "You know what I mean," Richard said, his tone low and sharp. "Don't embarrass this family." Ethan wanted to scream, to tell his father he was done hiding, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he stood, tossing a few bills on the table. "I have to go," he said, and walked out, the diner's bell jangling behind him. He wandered the city for hours, the encounter replaying in his mind. By the time he reached the Anchor, it was late, the bar quieter than usual. Caleb was there, as always, and the sight of him loosened the knot in Ethan's chest. He told Caleb about the meeting, the words tumbling out in a rush. Caleb listened, his jaw tight, and when Ethan finished, he reached across the bar and squeezed his hand. "You don't owe him anything," Caleb said. "You're not that kid anymore." Ethan wanted to believe him, but doubt gnawed at him. He spent the next few days wrestling with it, avoiding Caleb's texts and burying himself in work. The spark from that hug was still there, but so was the fear of rejection, of losing the fragile life he was building. Then came the night of the city's Pride Festival. Ethan hadn't planned to go, but Caleb showed up at his apartment, refusing to take no for an answer. "You don't have to march or anything," Caleb said, his grin infectious. "Just come. Be part of it." The festival was a riot of color and sound. Rainbow flags waving, music pulsing, people of every identity celebrating unapologetically. Ethan felt like an outsider at first, but Caleb's hand in his grounded him. They danced in the street, laughed with strangers, and for the first time, Ethan felt like he belonged somewhere. As the sun set, Caleb pulled him to a quieter corner of the festival, where a small stage hosted poets and speakers. "Read something," Caleb urged, handing Ethan his notebook. "Show them who you are." Ethan's heart raced, but the crowd's warmth, Caleb's steady presence, gave him courage. He took the stage and read a new poem, one he'd written after their hug, a raw, aching piece about breaking free from shame. The crowd roared, and when he stepped down, Caleb was there, pulling him into another embrace. This one felt different, charged, intimate, a promise of something more. That night, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city, Caleb turned to him. "I'm falling for you, Ethan," he said, his voice soft but sure. "And I think you're falling, too." Ethan's breath caught. He wanted to say it back, to let himself fall, but the shadows of his past still lingered. He squeezed Caleb's hand instead, hoping it was enough for now. Ethan's world was shifting, but the ground beneath him felt unsteady. Caleb's confession hung between them, a fragile thread Ethan was afraid to pull. He wanted to dive in, to let himself love without restraint, but the echo of his father's words, "Don't embarrass this family," kept him tethered to doubt. He threw himself into his art, designing bolder pieces, writing poems that bled with honesty. Caleb was a constant presence, showing up with coffee or dragging Ethan to jazz clubs, each moment weaving them closer. But Ethan still held back, guarding the deepest parts of himself. He hadn't told Caleb he loved him, though the words burned in his throat every time they were together. One rainy afternoon, Ethan got a call from Mia. "Dad's back in town," she said, her voice tense. "He's been asking about you. I think he knows about you being gay." Ethan's stomach churned. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing," Mia said. "But he's not stupid, Ethan. He saw a photo of you at Pride on someone's social media. He's not happy." The call left Ethan reeling. He imagined his father's anger, the same cold fury that had driven him from home at 16. He wanted to run, to disappear into the shadows again. But Caleb's voice in his head, "You're not that kid anymore," kept him anchored. That night, at the Anchor, Ethan read a poem about fear, his voice shaking but resolute. The crowd's applause was a lifeline, but it was Caleb's proud smile that steadied him. After, they walked to a nearby park, the city lights reflecting off wet pavement. Ethan finally told Caleb about his father's return, the photo, the threat of confrontation. Caleb's face darkened. "He doesn't get to control you anymore," he said. "But I get it. It's hard to let go of that fear." Ethan nodded, his throat tight. "I want to be with you," he admitted, the words spilling out. "But I'm scared I'll mess this up, that I'm not enough." Caleb took his face in his hands, his touch gentle but firm. "You are enough, Ethan. More than enough." Then he kissed him, soft and deliberate, under the glow of a street lamp. It was Ethan's first real kiss, and it felt like coming home. The next day, Ethan got a message from his father. "We need to talk now." Richard wanted to meet at a coffee shop downtown. Ethan's instinct was to refuse, but something in him, maybe Caleb's strength, maybe his own, pushed him to go. The coffee shop was crowded, the air thick with the scent of espresso. Richard sat at a corner table, his face a mask of disapproval. "I saw you," he said without preamble, "at that parade, with some guy." Ethan's heart pounded, but he held his father's gaze. "His name's Caleb," he said, his voice steady. "And I love him." The words shocked Ethan as much as they did Richard. His father's face reddened, but before he could speak, Ethan continued. "I've spent my whole life hiding because of you. I'm done." Richard stood, his chair scraping the floor. "You're no son of mine," he spat and left. Ethan sat there, trembling, but a strange calm settled over him. He'd faced his father and survived. He texted Caleb, who met him outside the shop minutes later. Without a word, Caleb pulled him into a hug, and Ethan let himself lean into it, the weight of his past falling away. The next weeks were a blur of freedom. Ethan and Caleb grew closer, their relationship deepening with every shared moment. Ethan's art flourished, his designs catching the eye of a local gallery owner who offered him a spot in an upcoming show. He told Mia everything, and she cried, promising to visit soon. But the past wasn't done with Ethan yet. One night, as he and Caleb left the Anchor, a group of men followed them. Their slurs cut through the night, sharp and venomous. Ethan froze, his old fears surging, but Caleb stepped forward, his firefighter's instincts kicking in. "Back off," he said, his voice low and dangerous. The men hesitated, then dispersed, but the encounter left Ethan shaken. He realized that even in Seattle, even with Caleb, the world could still be cruel. But Caleb's hand in his, steady and warm, reminded him he wasn't alone anymore. The gallery show was a milestone Ethan never thought he'd reach. The space, a sleek loft in Pioneer Square, buzzed with people admiring his work, bold digital prints and handwritten poems framed like treasures. Ethan stood in the center, wearing a crisp blazer Caleb had picked out, feeling like he was living someone else's life. Caleb was by his side, beaming with pride, his hand brushing Ethan's whenever the crowd felt overwhelming. The show was a success. Several pieces sold, and the gallery owner, a sharp woman named Lena, offered Ethan a solo exhibition. "You've got something special," she said. "Don't stop." Ethan nodded, dazed, his heart swelling with a joy he hadn't known was possible. But the high was fleeting. The encounter with the hecklers lingered, a reminder that the world wasn't always kind. Ethan started noticing things, suspicious glances on the bus, whispered comments in stores. He wondered if his father had spread word back home, if the small-town gossip had followed him to Seattle. The thought made him shrink back, his old instincts urging him to hide. Caleb noticed the change. One night, as they cooked dinner in Ethan's apartment, he set down the knife he was using to chop vegetables and turned to Ethan. "You've been quiet," he said. "What's going on?" Ethan hesitated, then told him about the paranoia, the fear that his newfound openness would cost him. Caleb listened, his face serious, then pulled Ethan close. "The world's not perfect," he said, "but you don't have to face it alone. We're in this together." Those words carried Ethan through the next weeks. He threw himself into preparing for the solo exhibition, pouring his fears and hopes into his art. Caleb was his rock, showing up with takeout when Ethan worked late, reading his poems and offering feedback, loving him in a way Ethan was still learning to accept. One evening, as they walked through Pike Place Market, Caleb stopped at a stall selling handmade journals. He bought one, its leather cover embossed with a tree, and handed it to Ethan. "For your next chapter," he said, his eyes soft. Ethan clutched the journal, overwhelmed by the weight of Caleb's belief in him. But the shadows returned in the form of a letter from his father. It arrived in a plain envelope, the handwriting unmistakable. Richard wrote of regret, but not apology. He wanted Ethan to come home and fix things, as if Ethan's identity was a mistake to be corrected. The letter ended with a plea: "Don't throw away your family for this." Ethan read it alone in his apartment, the words cutting deeper than he'd expected. He didn't tell Caleb, not wanting to burden him. Instead, he buried himself in his art, his poems growing darker, more jagged. The night before the exhibition, he broke down, sobbing in his studio, the letter crumpled in his hand. Caleb found him there, having let himself in with the spare key Ethan had given him. Without a word, he sat beside Ethan, pulling him into his arms. "You don't have to carry this alone," Caleb whispered. "Let me in." Ethan showed him the letter, and Caleb's face hardened. "He's wrong," he said. "You're not throwing anything away. You're building something better." The exhibition was a triumph. Ethan's work, raw, honest, unapologetic, drew a crowd that spilled onto the street. He read a new poem, one dedicated to Caleb, about finding light in the darkest places. The applause was thunderous, but it was Caleb's tear-streaked face in the front row that mattered most. After, as they stood outside the gallery, Caleb took Ethan's hand. "I'm so proud of you," he said, "and I love you." Ethan's heart swelled. "I love you too," he said, the words finally free. They kissed under the stars, the city alive around them, and for the first time, Ethan felt whole. The months that followed were a delicate balance of joy and healing. Ethan and Caleb moved in together, a small apartment overlooking the Puget Sound, where they built a life filled with music, art, and quiet moments that felt like miracles. Ethan's art career flourished, his work featured in local magazines, and he began mentoring young queer artists, sharing the courage he'd found. But the past was never far. Ethan's father sent another letter, this one softer, asking to meet. Ethan debated ignoring it, but Caleb encouraged him to face it, not for Richard, but for himself. "You deserve closure," Caleb said, his hand steady in Ethan's. They met at a park, the same one where Caleb had first hugged him. Richard looked smaller, his eyes tired. "I don't understand you," he admitted, "but I don't want to lose you." Ethan took a deep breath, the spark from Caleb's love giving him strength. "I'm not lost," he said. "I'm finally found. If you want to be part of my life, you have to accept all of me." Richard didn't respond, but he nodded, a small gesture that felt like a crack in his armor. They parted without promises, but Ethan felt lighter, as if he'd finally set down a burden he'd carried too long. Life wasn't perfect. There were still moments of doubt, nights when Ethan woke from dreams of his father's anger or the heckler's slurs. But Caleb was there, his presence a reminder that love could be stronger than fear. They attended Pride together, marched in the parade, and Ethan read his poetry to a crowd that cheered for their shared resilience. One evening, as they sat on their balcony, Caleb handed Ethan a small box. Inside was a ring, simple and silver, etched with a tiny flame. "It's not a proposal," Caleb said, his voice teasing but warm. "Not yet. It's a promise. That I'm with you, no matter what." Ethan slipped the ring on, tears in his eyes. "I promise too," he said, and they kissed, the city lights sparkling below them. Years later, Ethan would look back on that first hug at the Anchor as the moment his life began. He'd spent countless years in the shadows, hiding from a world that didn't always understand. But Caleb's love, fierce and unwavering, had lit a spark that grew into a flame, guiding him back to himself. He was no longer a ghost. He was Ethan Harper, artist, poet, lover, and finally free.